As kids, we sometimes played a silly game called Pick Up Sticks. You may have played a variation of the same game, where a handful of long, toothpick-like sticks were dropped in a random, convoluted pile, and the player's goal was to pull out of the pile one stick at a time, hopefully without causing any other sticks to move. If one moved, then you lost your turn. Bringing order to complexity is a difficult task. It requires careful thought, gentle maneuvering, and bold decisions. As we learn playing that game, it might not be easy, and every effort isn't successful, but it is possible to make progress over time. As church leaders, we are asked to lead very complicated organizations, and the same three elements must be applied to our ministries. If we hope to bring alignment to our tangled web of schedules, programs, and meetings, we too will need to apply careful thought, gentle maneuvering, and bold decisions. But a clear objective can make it easier to create an effective strategy for success. In this session, using a military analogy, we are going to learn that if your church family can better understand the mission of your church, they will be more likely to help achieve it. And not only will they support the cause, but also they will join the fight. So let's rally the troops and learn how to unite a church around the mission.
You don't have to read very far into the Bible to discover why life can be so difficult. We all woke up this morning behind enemy lines. We were born in a war zone. The Apostle Paul describes the Christian life as a battlefield, challenged the Ephesian believers to appropriate full combat gear so that we could survive the persistent guerrilla warfare being waged by our enemy. The incarnation, essentially a military invasion, and the beachhead was Bethlehem. Jesus himself said as much when he declared how the prince of this world must be driven out, and that the gates of Hades would not be able to stand up to the onslaught of his church. Well, much like every successful military commander who's ever gone to war, Jesus had a clear objective for the invasion, a strategic initiative to fulfill that objective, and a tactical approach to counter any defense by the enemy, what Paul described as the enemy's methodia, which is Greek for the devil's schemes. That's military terminology. Strategy refers to the general direction of operations to meet an overall objective. Tactics implement strategy by short-term decisions on the movement of troops and employment of assets in the field. Military initiatives are high-stakes games of dominoes. A clear objective is required to have a meaningful conversation about strategy. Clear strategy leads to effective decisions about tactics. And if those tactics work, the objective is met. And the objective, Jesus said, is to save the lost. He said it this way, Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. I cannot restate that any more succinctly than he did. The strategy is the local church. Jesus said, I will build my church and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. That's as clear as it is bold. Jesus didn't say that he would build your church. He didn't say he'd build my church because quite frankly, we don't have a church. Neither should we ever want one. We got enough problems already. There's only one church, and it belongs to Jesus. He bought it with his blood, he owns it outright, and one of the perks of ownership is that he gets to decide how he wants to build it. Generation ago, church growth language began to dominate the conversation. No doubt, church growth is strategic, but that's the point. The church, the local church, is the strategy, not the objective. Unfortunately, one of the unintended and unfortunate consequences of the church growth movement is that for many of us, growing a local church became the objective. Filling up the seats in the sanctuary, hopefully several times each weekend, was the primary goal. Where the people came from really didn't matter that much. Well, the tactic that Jesus embedded in his strategy involves what I call transformational relationships, otherwise known as oikos. Like Jesus told the man he had healed, when he cast that demon out of his body, and he told him to go home to your own people, to your oikos, and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. Now, once again, to briefly state our foundational premise, 95% of the people who place their faith in Jesus do so primarily because of someone or a combination of people they already know, through interaction with their own people. But notice how those three elements of warfare are essentially what Simon Sinek referred to in the golden circle. What, how, why. The what is strategic, to build the church. The how is tactical, transformational relationships. And the why is the objective, to save the lost. Now, what you do as a church leader is probably Number 1, conduct weekly worship services. Number 2, encourage people to regularly meet in small groups. And number 3, recruit as many people as you can to serve in the support roles required. Keep your church going. You do those 3 things, I do those 3 things. But so do our favorite megachurch pastors, because megachurch, mini-church doesn't matter. Now, many churches may do more, but most of us can probably all agree that we have at least those 3 whats in common with the most successful churches in the world. That's strategy. Strategy is the what. Now, how we do it is very different from one another, depending on the level of giftedness that you and I bring to the table, or the level of resources that your church family or my church family can provide. You might have noticed that most of the really large churches in the United States happen to have been planted in some of the most affluent regions of the United States. And there's nothing wrong with that, although if we're not careful, it can create envy in the rest of us. But the level of potential resources available to pastors drastically affects their hows. But that's a funny thing. The how that Jesus encouraged, and the only how that doesn't depend on levels of ability or budget, and the only how that has stood the test of time through multiple cultural cycles is oikos. If redemption is the academy, then oikos is the textbook for Tactics 101. As significant as that is, the tactical effectiveness of oikos is still dependent on a clear and compelling why. The why of the church is framed by the objective to, as Jesus said, save the lost. That's why we're in this thing, to follow Jesus in his assault on Fort Hades. If growing a local church ever becomes our objective, we're on our own. But over the past 50 years, it has become our objective. And I believe that's why we can only compel 20% of the people in this country to go to church. You can't begin to talk strategy until you're clear on the objective. You'll never accomplish the what until you've established the why. The objective is the why. It's really important to keep that why in mind as you plan your worship services, as you orchestrate your small groups or other ministry systems, and as you organize opportunities to serve in your church. The reason the why must remain central to your mission is because it is your mission. Yet your church, my church, and every church will always default to pettiness about strategy unless you give them something better to do than argue, something more important than argue, like bring lost people to Jesus.